happy year anniversary since your amazing book came out that I have here.
It is a year. That's right. Thank you.
What I got from your book was that if parents could get out of their own way and deal and manage with their triggers and regulate their emotions to hold space for their boys, then that would have such a huge effect on a boy's well-being, psychological well-being, if a parent can hold space. Like, I've been in therapy since I've been 19. I view myself as someone who's psychologically savvy. I work on parts work. I'm aware of my triggers. I know when I'm being inflamed. And yet it's really hard sometimes for me to regulate. And I can't imagine, like, if you're in an abusive relationship, unhappy relationship, if you can't pay the bills, if you are working 3 jobs, like, if there are other kind of circumstances.
No, it's really helpful to be reminded, Kimmy, in those really practical and immediate ways from those in the trenches. What I'm, what the requirement actually amounts to in a personal way, day to day to day. I know it's hard. I mean, it was hard for me. It continues to be hard. When I'm with my grandson, there are times where I'm asked to do things that, in my mind, how it formulates is, this is the last thing in the world I want to be doing right now.
Totally. Like, I don't want to be playing Pokemon right now.
Stop the torture.
Right. Get off my head.
But I feel like my role is to speak from what we know from developmental science about how to build strong hearts and minds. And that those ideas have just never really been applied to male development in any kind of a consistent way. So I feel like my job is to tout those really simple, basic strategies as a means to helping a boy resist the deprecations of popular culture that will otherwise hijack them.
Right. I mean, something I really liked that you said was that a mother-son relationship is really important and often determines what kind of relationships the boy gets into later in life. And
Yeah.
what I liked about that is that I think sometimes people react from a place of, well, I don't want my son being a mama's boy.
It's very different than out of one's own needs, fostering a dependency instead of fostering initiative and power.
Yes.
And, making that distinction, I think, is sometimes hard for parents to recognize because it requires us to notice how we are, exporting our own needs into a relationship where they really don't belong. It's hard, I think, also for us to notice that our kids are not just hearing our words and seeing our faces, they're feeling us. What we know about the phenomenon of attunement, my animal brain and your animal brain are in sync. We all know what it feels like to perceive our imperfections as parents, our shortcomings, and to notice that we are doing damage to our children. The last thing in the world we want to do, that we are unconsciously, perpetuating one generation to the next, things that we carry that we really don't want to pass along to our sons. We want, in fact, the opposite. We want our sons to be free of the garbage of our own, hurts and trauma. This is a question that comes up every time I talk to audiences of parents. Worries essentially that if we don't teach boys what the parameters are, if we don't fit boys into the man box, that they're likely to do things that will jeopardize their standing with their peer group and their achievement of that lofty purpose of becoming a man. And I think that the truth really is that strong men come from secure attachments, and trying to push out that developmental science foundation and to think about it in terms of male development That's really the work I'm trying to do.
I heard you say that some interviews you had that men would call in, some radio interview you did, and someone was saying, like, so you want my son to be a girl? That there's this kind of fear that people have about boys being like a girl, as if that's a bad thing. And I'm wondering if you think that that stems from misogyny, or like where that comes from.
It's a complicated question, I think, and I think there's three sources to that fear, which is, I think, in every parent's heart when we come to raise a boy. And I don't think any of these three are particularly well noticed or acknowledged. I think they're sort of insidious and so deeply kind of woven into our our minds and our hearts. But you're right. I think the first one is misogyny. I think this notion of there being a binary distinction between male and female, and that history of being male being superior, um, has meant that there's a great sort of fragility about um, the achievement of that masculine prerogative, that masculine supremacy, and it needs to be carefully monitored so that we're not feminine. We have nothing to do with that other. I think that dynamic. I think it's archaic, it's instinctual, it's corrupting of our developmental understanding of boys. But this idea that boys are fragile, that the achievement of masculinity, of being a man, is fragile. I think it shows up in so many different ways. So the parent who watches her son at 4 years old on a kitty kicker soccer team, and observe that her son prefers to pick flowers than to ball.
The
You know,
bee.
you know, I just think that those fears are ancient and need to be acknowledged, and they are rooted in a fundamental disdain for the feminine. Is number two, the close relationship between misogyny and homophobia.
Yeah.
That's the particular way, or that's the more active way, I think, that things play out in a young boy's life, is that we don't want our sons to act gay or like sissies or mama's boy. I think that's a coded version of the same. The third one is that there's a reality to the peer group context that our sons are going to operate in. And the reality is, it shows up in Judy Chu's book when she's following 4, 5, and 6-year-old boys, that the boys that dared, to stay too close to their moms, or who strayed outside of the normative definition of masculinity, they got policed. And what we know is that the ubiquitous presence of threat and violence in our sons' lives means that if they go too far outside of off the beaten path, they might well be targeted for bullying, or worse, exclusion, humiliation. We also know that we can't really fight our sons' battles for them because we can't be there with them. So what we default to is hoping that they can at least internalize the appearance of conformity. They know how to look the part.
Wait, so hold on. Are you saying I can't beat up a kid who's bullying my son?
Yeah. You might want to, and you might even be compelled to.
I can't get on that bus and be like, "What are you saying to my son?" I'm just kidding. I wouldn't.
That will come back and bite your son in the butt.
Right, exactly. No, I wouldn't.
Because what will happen is that that boy's mom intervened in that way, kind of validates the suspicion, that
he can't, right,
defend for himself.
When I told my father about Build Up Boys, his first response was, "You don't want to take away their competitive spirit."
Yeah, that's
Boys
the
need their competitive spirit. And I was like, I don't want to take anything away. Like, I just want to give them the ability to not have to hide everything and to emotionally express. It's hurting our boys and men. Like, you just look at the research. There's, as you said, like, I have you as a quote, it's like, it's harder to be a boy. They smoke more, they get in more trouble. Like, boys are having a hard time, men are having a hard time. So I feel like teaching that kind of emotional intelligence really young and giving them that sense of like it's okay to be close with other boys, it's okay to be expressive, there's strength in that, it doesn't mean the opposite of that. I think that's so important to kind of shift that culture, like shift that conversation.
Yeah, your point that boys are having a hard time. There was a piece that I just read this morning, how young men are actually showing up at higher rates in this COVID infection.
Oh, I did read about that.
And I think that, whether it's COVID and male vulnerability, or the fact that young men predominate on the 15 leading causes of premature mortality, the physical vulnerability of being a male is just something that we've not thought about well at all. So much, and the explanation, whether it's COVID or these 15 leading causes of premature mortality, is that it's both biological and behavioral. Women have stronger immune systems generally. So male vulnerability begins with that kind of biological vulnerability. But the things we do, the ways we've been trained to care for ourselves, the way we demonstrate our invulnerability by taking unwise risks or acting macho, or as silly as not wearing sunscreen. You know,
So something that I've encountered in my mother focus groups, and we also just did this little pilot to test some of the curriculum we have, and my partner Paul spoke to the fathers and I spoke to the mothers. Something that keeps coming up over and over, which I find really interesting, and I don't know because it's just a white heterosexual population, so I don't know how this would act out, in other cultures, areas, sexuality, relationships, is that there's so much disdain for men among women. So there was this mothers group that I did, and Paul had to leave early one night. When Paul left, the gloves came off. Like someone was like, yeah, men are stupid. They're such idiots. They're such morons. And then someone got really offended. She has older boys. She's like, that's not true. Men are really smart. But it was fascinating to me, and I wasn't judging it because I was like, this is what needs to be unearthed and talked about. But if you're treating your husband like he's inept, or if you have such hatred or disdain because men have hurt you, then what is that showing boys? Like, how is that acting out in how a boy identifies being male?
another complicated question.
You're like, it's too damn early in the morning.
Lots to say about that. I guess the first thing to say is that are we in a pendulum swing historical moment,
Right.
driven by the unfinished business of gender equality, achieving gender equality? Is there a calling out of, male misbehavior, sexism, misogyny, ways in which male supremacy is still rooted in the culture in so many ways? Yeah, I think probably that's true.
Right. And I understand the need to fight for, I want to be paid what my male counterpart is paid. I don't want my rape to be treated like it doesn't matter. I understand fighting for all of those things and equal rights and having that rage. That rage makes sense. It was the men are stupid within the domestic environment
Yeah.
or inept or not helpful or whatever it is, that seemed more concerning to me for the boy being raised in that environment, like how that would translate.
And you're in good company. You know, whenever I'm talking to audiences, some version of this question will come up. You know, people asking, you know, all my son hears about is toxic masculinity. How is he supposed to feel proud and good about himself as a male under that kind of cultural condition? And what I can say to you is that I've just been really, really encouraged by the attitude of mothers generally.
Yeah.
Um, I was out.
I don't mean to be putting down mothers. I just found that an interesting.
No, but it's a really important question, Kimmy, and I'm glad you've asked it. But I was going to tell you that I was out in San Francisco giving a talk to an organization that sponsors service projects for mothers and their sons, Young Men's Service League out in the Bay Area. And this particular night, 250 mothers came into the room. It was me and 250 moms doing my talk.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was truly the energy, the sense of being, you know, completely overwhelmingly outnumbered. Um, and yet what, you know, and the things I had to say were the things I say, the challenging things I say about how to be with your son and what he needs from you, and, you know, the impact of misogyny on generating this mama's boy myth, the
Right.
impact of that, those kinds of things. And what I found was, you know, these moms were right with me.
Right.
Their questions were sincere. Their commitment to their sons was profound. These were moms. Now, it was a selective audience. These were
Yeah,
moms that had already decided that
they sought you out. They wanted that.
and they were part of an organization that where they had signed up, both themselves and their sons, to spend time doing service projects as a way of fostering deeper connections.
Right.
They were already on the idea, you know, that I want to make sure my son and I have a strong relationship. And I think I was speaking to a choir, but, you know.
But I'd be interested if those mothers, if they were asked or pulled aside how they feel about their husbands,
Yeah.
what would come up? Because I think the intention, all the women that I've collected to talk to, they're coming because they want something like this for their sons. They're feminists. They want their sons to be good to women. They want their sons to be emotionally free. And yet they have a lot of issues with their husbands.
Yeah. Or, you know, with their dads.
Right. Or with their dads.
Or with their brother.
Sure.
You know, all that baggage that women carry from growing up in a culture that has been, you know, demeaning, threatening, or worse.
Right.
I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, this is the historical moment that your sons are coming up in, my sons are coming up in. And I think it's a necessary, critically important correction. And maybe at the expense of the boys absorbing some of that attitude,
Right.
some of that rage. The benefit to them is that girls and women are not going to as quickly or willingly subordinate themselves.
Right.
And that's what we're finding in research, is that the kinds of households that millennials and younger generations are establishing are just more equal. Can I say one more thing to your question?
Please, yeah.
Just to validate the question even more, maybe. So I was asked to come to a school up in Stamford, Connecticut, earlier this year, and do 2 days of talks and workshops. And they were bringing me after they had brought other speakers previously, and they had, I think, had a number of speakers speaking about gender equality, ending sexism and all of its different manifestations, really advocating for girls and women. And I was the first speaker they'd had come in a co-ed school to talk about boys.
Yeah.
And what I found was the gratitude that the boys expressed to me or talking to them. I gave a talk to the high school boys, and the football coach insisted that all of his players show up. And so I was talking mostly to a group of football playing boys in high school, and I was talking about their dependence on a good relationship with a teacher or a coach in order to engage. The research that I did that identified boys as relational learners.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking about how important that is for them, how difficult it is when they have a breakdown in the relationship, and what I want them to do to take responsibility to get what they need from their teacher or their coach. And the boys were so grateful that I was talking to them in that direct way, challenging them, but recognizing their vulnerability at the same time.
And that they were so grateful for it. That's what Peggy Orenstein said when
Yeah.
I heard her speak and talk, that they were desperate for someone to ask them these questions.
Right. And, in Peggy's book, she talks about coming into the school for the first interview and seeing the boy she was going to be interviewing, sitting in a chair, slumped over, looking disheveled, earphones in his ears, and saying to herself, "Oh God, this isn't going to go well," and being totally surprised that the stereotype she had of how that boy looked and what it meant was so different than his reality.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what we're going to find is that boys are quite willing to play on a more equal field with girls, but they desperately, your word, desperately long to be understood themselves and for people to understand what they're up against. She used the word overcompromise, that boys forced into these cultural norms give up really important capacities like being authentic, being honest about your feelings, being comfortable being yourself in favor of playing a part. She says in these really powerful ways, she says that boys travel from being present in their relationships to being pretentious, to pretending by way of posturing.
Right.
Right.
Obviously, we're in this pandemic. It's horrible. It's causing a lot of stir craziness. It's causing a lot of anxiety, not just for people's health, but for their financial standing. There's what resources or support people had before, like babysitters or grandparents or whatever, that is out the door. And it's hard. It's been very hard. And so talk about like being dysregulated. And so you were talking about kids feeling what adults are feeling. Do you have any recommendations or tips for how parents can figure out how to regulate or what to do to help?
I think I mentioned to you that Promundo organization conducted this survey of parents, and we're just now working on writing a final report that's going to come out, I think, in the next few weeks. And the title of the report, still playing with titles, but the title that appealed to me was "Staying at Home with Our Sons," taking full advantage of this pandemic moment to facilitate our sons' emotional resilience. I think that it's true that all of us are facing uncommon stresses now. This existential threat that COVID represents seeps into all of our minds. A barrage, the daily barrage of news, the creeping, rise in fatalities all around us, so forth and so on. One of the pieces I read this morning was about how everyone's having weird dreams these days.
Totally.
Lots of bug dreams. One of the
I had snake. I mean, not a bug, but a big snake.
Nice. But all of the different sort of fears and the ways that the fears are sort of manifesting, in our dreams, but I think we're carrying them. That's affecting our sons too.
Right.
And boys are feeling the unsettledness. I was on a Zoom conference with about 17 senior boys in a high school emotional literacy program last week. And what struck me, the whole point of that emotional literacy program is to normalize boys being able to talk about their feelings with each other. That's who they most want to talk to. Parents, for sure, but other guys that are in the trenches with me, that are living the same kinds of stresses and challenges and opportunities. That's really who I think is going to best understand me
Mm-hmm.
in some ways. And so on this Zoom call, I gave each boy 5 minutes to talk about whatever they needed to in this moment. And the anger at their lives being disrupted, the losses that they've experienced. One boy had spent 6 months cast as the lead in the spring musical,
Aww.
and the musical didn't happen.
Yeah,
It was
that's very
called off the day before. His big shining moment after 4 years of being an understudy in various theatrical productions. This was his time. Guys that are captains of their lacrosse team, guys that are still looking to be recruited to play at college level, people that have been recruited and don't know if the spring's going to happen, or I'm sorry, if the start of the semester in the summer is going to happen. So lots and lots of disappointment and loss that they legitimately got to be angry about. Boys that had to express loneliness, missing each other, in a peer culture where you don't really show those feelings much.
right.
But we had one boy say, "I love you guys," and I miss you.
Start crying.
And I can give permission as an adult, kind of creating the space. I can't tell them how to be themselves, but what is so encouraging to me is if we make the space, they show up.
Yeah, I love that.
The human natures that are so powerful and so dependable. If we make the space, I think we'll find our sons will show up. So with respect to families staying at home with their sons,
It's actually amazing.
what I would say is the chance is that for many boys, it's less stressful than being at school.
Yeah, my sons do seem happier.
And I'm hearing that across the board, by the way. I'm hearing that generally. They're not facing the same academic pressures. They're not facing the same peer pressures. There's a safety to it.
Yeah.
So they're perhaps more open, and, less tense, less hardened, less steeled, less in a defensive posture, and just use those tools I recommend. The tools of listening and in particular special time, to offer a space where your sons feel like they have your undivided attention. That there's not a right answer or a wrong answer. They get to be themselves. They have you, and that you're willing to go to wherever they want to go with you. And like a divining rod, they're going to go where they need to go. The basic theory behind play therapy, for example, is that the kinds of themes that emerge in the play will be the themes that the child needs to work out.
Right.
I think the same is true in the special time context generally. And just trust that whether it's playing a video game or having a pillow fight or drawing or telling stories, whatever it might be, that your son is doing the work he needs to do to process the stresses of the moment. I don't think it takes more than that. I don't think you have to tell boys things about,
What's happening, right? There's no, right. It's not an educational moment. It's just more
it's
use
a strengthening of the relationship moment is how I think of it.
Say that one more time.
It's a strengthening of the relationship moment. That's
Yeah.
the opportunity here.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I love talking to you.
Yeah, likewise.
I'm such a fan, but you know that. Yeah,
well,
you're
I
awesome.
enjoyed our partnership.